Hi, this is the overview video for Module 3, Interpretivism. So we reviewed functionalism and critical theory. Those are two macro-level theoretical frames, and interpretivism is a micro-level frame. What that means is that it's really interested in the particular, interested in the context, and in most cases, the phenomenon under study is going to have multiple interpretations. And those interpretations might be functional or critical. The difference between both a functional and critical view and an interpretivist view is that there could be more than one explanation, and the overriding explanation for the phenomenon might depend on the context. So as you read, you'll see the theorists starting to ask the participants of their research what meaning they're making about what's going on, what they're witnessing, and ask the participants to explain the rules of the game that they're playing, the rules of society in the case of studying social phenomenon, the rules of doing school in the case of studying why some groups succeed by the traditional measures that we assume about success, doing well on assignments, conforming to behavioral expectations, graduating on time, going on to college, and those things. So you can see Max Weber here. So I'm pulling these images where I can so that you aren't just left with a lot of names floating around in your head. And I always suggest that you look into the lives of the theorists that you encounter to understand how to place them and what the influences were on their thoughts, especially what time they lived, in what countries, under what kind of government regimes too. So Max Weber is a social researcher, and he is sometimes said to represent a functionalist view and sometimes said to represent a critical view. If you study sociology, I think you probably take away from Weber some observation of social rules that tend to be more neutrally explained than not, although he acknowledges social stratification as something that is expected, that is normal but not natural. And what I mean by that is that you can expect for societies to organize themselves into social hierarchies, but there's nothing natural about it. It's always going to be at the advantage of those with more power. So he recognized the operation of power, and for that reason alone, someone might think of him as being critical. It's kind of in between. So now you're getting the flavor of interpretivism. So it really depends, or there could be multiple ways of doing things, or multiple ways of looking at things. Let's go back a little bit. Yeah, so one point about interpretivism is that there's a lot of influence from anthropology. And so anthropologists are interested in the people that are acting, and they want to understand the social phenomenon from their perspective as a researcher outside of the phenomenon, and also from the perspective of the people engaged in it. So the emic perspective, or the insider perspective. In terms of social reproduction, that's still observed. Like I said, Weber saw that different social classes and stratifications were reproduced. And it kind of depends on who you ask for your explanation of how this works. Does it work perfectly? Who's involved? Is there agency? Who's benefiting? So the institutions of society are set up to reproduce the status quo. So that's taken as a fact, as an assumption. But it depends on the context and the perspective, whether the social reproduction mechanism works perfectly, thoroughly, to what degree, and people have different perspectives about whether or not there is something inherently wrong with social reproduction, and it's going to have a different effect on people depending on how they view the system. And then we see that from John Ogbu's work. So a micro view, in other words, multiple, contextual, it depends is the answer in a lot of cases. Like we've seen before, socialization means learning the rules of the game, but interpretivists view socialization as a somewhat active process. It's not completely passive. It's not something that's done to you. It's something that you participate in. So it has to do with what rules of the game you focus on, how you internalize them, whether or not you see yourself as powerful and effective within your society or within the game, and how you interpret your role. And that's within limits, right? So you are, if you're born into a particular social class and you have a particular limited role and limited finances, you certainly have choices, and your choices are going to vary depending on different social status categories that you occupy and different privileges that you have. But you're not going to be able to exceed the limits of the role or the income. So, but how you interpret your role there and what you think of your place in society really matters a lot, it turns out, for your sense of well-being and your actual outcomes, your social outcomes, your health outcomes, your education outcomes, your work outcomes, your marriage outcomes. So what's the role of school in this process? That's what we're focusing on. In that way, we're doing an applied sociology. All of this is applied, and our field is education. So in particular, the public schools, what's the role of schools in this socialization process from the point of view of interpretivism? And you get an emphasis both on socialization, a process happening to you, an inculcation of the norms of society, and an interpretation of those rules, how deeply you're going to believe them, whether or not you're going to resist them, whether or not you're going to fight to change them. It has to do with you. The co-creation of a democratic society. We see a possibility here. Functionalists do as well, though. But interpretivists say that it's not guaranteed. A democratic system isn't the inevitable outcome of the processes that we're doing right now. A critical review would look at our governmental processes and evaluate our political system as a plutocracy, not as a democracy, as a rule by a few powerful groups. That seems to be the logical conclusion based on the way that our policy decisions have been made. It doesn't mean we can't aspire to being a democracy and that those are our stated ideals, but it requires some work. You can also be a radical interpretivist, and interpretivists of all kinds are accused of being radical relativists, meaning that the question about the school's role is meaningless, independent of a particular context. In other words, an interpretivist would want to know what school. There's no such thing as the school. If there's one rule about public schools in the United States, for example, is that there's no one model of schools in the United States. So the functionalists can describe the average or the aspirational school, the school the way it's supposed to be. Critical folks like Anyan will point out that there are different kinds of schooling for different classes of students meant to help in the reproduction of social class. But interpretivists will want to know, what particular school are you talking about? So hermeneutics is sometimes a mysterious concept. And so I brought in a little video for us to watch from Dr. Victor Gisbers from the University of Leiden. So again, German, following in the footsteps of the Weberian tradition. But this professor is also coming from humanities, and which includes religious study, and it's in the interpretation of sacred texts that we get the term hermeneutics, and it's meant to imply that the interpretation of the text, and it doesn't have to be a literal text, it can be a description of what's going on in a phenomenon, any particular social phenomenon, but the interpretation of the text should be based on nothing but the text itself. It's a completely internal and reflexive interpretation. So there's also the view that there's no such thing as the correct interpretation, but some interpretations can be evaluated as better than others if they correspond to the facts contained in the text. So you can read an entire text and come to a conclusion about the themes or the overriding thesis, say. And we ask children to do this when they're learning how to develop reading comprehension strategies, and we say provide evidence. So if you provide evidence backing up your explanation for the theme of a text, then your interpretation would be evaluated as being better than someone who had no proof, or whose proof actually contradicted their own explanation of the thesis. So if you want to look at a good interpretation of hermeneutics, we can watch this.
Interpretation, finding out what the meaning of something is an important activity of scholars in almost all the humanities. Whether you are trying to translate an ancient inscription, understand the short stories of a modernist writer, or make sense of a 17th century painting, you are attempting to find out the meaning of the object that you are studying. This is a big difference with the natural sciences, since natural occurrences don't have these kinds of meanings. A volcanic eruption or the fall of an apple don't mean anything. They just happen. But the humanities study products of the human mind, and these do have meanings. It follows that an important part of the methodology of the humanities will be concerned with interpretation. How do you interpret something? What makes one interpretation better than another? And how can we argue about that in a scientific way? These questions are investigated by hermeneutics, the study of interpretation. In this lecture, we will look at the most influential idea about interpretation, an idea that almost all people who engage in hermeneutics agree with in one form or another, namely the idea of the hermeneutic circle. In later lectures, we will also get to know hermeneutics as a movement within the humanities, which doesn't just study interpretation, but also emphasizes the importance of interpretation. But for now, let's focus on this thing called the hermeneutic circle. The key insight upon which the hermeneutic circle is based is the insight that meaning is holistic. What does that mean? It means that the meaning of a whole, for instance a text, is not just the sum of the meanings of its parts. Meaning is determined by the whole as a whole, not by the parts individually. Let's try to make that more concrete. Take weight or heaviness. Weight is not holistic. The weight of a bag is simply the sum of the weight of the bag itself plus the weights of all the individual objects that are in the bag. If you add an apple that weighs 200 grams to the bag, the weight of the bag as a whole will go up by 200 grams. So we can assign weights to the individual objects, and when we put them together, we just add up the weights. That is not holistic, but its opposite, which is sometimes called atomistic. But now take tastiness. The tastiness of a dish is not the sum of the tastiness of the individual ingredients. Salmon tastes great, peanut butter tastes great, but very few people would like to eat salmon with peanut butter. A great chef, on the other hand, can mix different ingredients to create a dish that transcends the taste of any of the individual ingredients. So there is an amount of holism here. The taste of the whole is not just the sum of the tastes of the ingredients. Now, meaning is even more holistic than taste. Not only is it the case that the meaning of the whole is not just the sum of the meanings of the parts, but in fact, the parts don't even really have meanings if they are not part of a whole. Take, for instance, the word can. What does it mean? Well, you don't really know. It means one thing in the sentence, I can do that, and it means something else entirely in the sentence, I open a can of beans. The word can alone doesn't have a determinate meaning apart from its context. It only gets a specific meaning when it is placed in a sentence. But obviously that means that the meaning of the sentence can't be the sum of the meaning of the words, because apart from the sentence, the words don't have meanings. This is not just true about words. A sentence too doesn't have a specific meaning when you look at it alone, apart from its context. If you're
So I'm going to stop there because we're not interested in linguistics right now, but I wanted you to hear someone describe the hermeneutic circle, which is, again, something really hard to grasp outside of these very concrete explanations. And there's some, I think, 10 more minutes left of this lecture. So if you want to watch this later, access the slides that are hyperlinked, because this being a video, you won't be able to advance the slides or the video within the video. So there's another video that I provided for you. It's in this module, and it's on Dr. Craig Gelling describing Paul Willis's work. So this is a British and industrial context. And so you hear this professor describing the work that Paul Willis wrote about the working class lads and their resistance to the schools. And you see that Paul Willis's work also could be considered critical, but because he's focused on the meaning making of his participants, we recognize him as interpretive, because he contradicts functionalism. You can't say that the lads in his study who are resisting the model of a middle-class citizen being presented for them in their school context, you can't say that they are passive in this regard. You can't say that the school is the function that is propelling these lads into their working class status. They are actively cultivating a working class culture and running headfirst into a working class lifestyle. And in fact, there's nothing wrong with that. When you look at large data sets that predict lifetime earnings of people depending on their degrees, depending on their fields, you see a disparity, but that isn't always an operation of an unfair system. Some people are choosing those careers, and in fact, we shouldn't arrange status or value of an occupation based on its salary. Now, some people would disagree with me and say this is inherently unfair about capitalism, and in more socialist system, you would have fewer differences, fewer ranges of inequality in wages. And in fact, that's a little bit closer to how I believe. I'm a supporter of a higher minimum wage, of a healthy social support system, and more taxes on the wealthy to actually shrink the amount of income inequality to reflect a more valuing of what we call physical labor. And the labor of women, for example. The reason that teaching salaries are so low is because they've been historically jobs done by women, and women's work has been historically devalued. So Willis's study was qualitative and subjective. So he is not collecting quantitative data. He is working with, observing, interviewing, listening to the lads and how they interact in their school. So the question is, right, if you're a critical person, are they being oppressed, or do they have agency? And they have agency in they actually refuse to accept the cultural values of the school. Is there something wrong with wanting to follow the same path as your parents and grandparents? No, absolutely not. Questions about that, again, lead us to uncover this prejudice that we have about some kinds of work, and just to ask questions about why some kinds of work are lead to such a low salary and fewer benefits than others. What does an education mean to the lads? The lads are involved in educating themselves and in learning how to operate as a working class person, and they're learning what counts as status within their in-group. And so the things that they do to demonstrate their status in their in-group are going to be at odds with the behavior expected in public schools to be a good student. And how do other groups in the society see them? Well, negatively, right? They're either pitied as, isn't that a shame? Isn't that a waste of a future, a waste of a promise? You have an opportunity to get educated and do something better than work in a factory, and isn't it a shame that you've squandered that opportunity? You can imagine that there are some people from the working class who said, this is an honest living, there's nothing wrong with this lifestyle, and we support you in your choices. There's something bothersome about the lads' working class culture in that it is violently sexist and also racist. So these are, social problems that we have to examine when we're doing interpretive studies of different work and life choices that people make. So why is it? Do we have explanations from functionalism or from Marxism? Or must we again go back to the specific context and inquire about the phenomenon from the participants themselves? So now we come to Ogbu, one of my favorite theorists, using an interpretive kind of lens, and his theory is called the cultural ecological theory. And he first started doing work in the late 70s, I think. And he is trying to understand why some students, some from minority backgrounds, do better or worse than others in school. So why wouldn't all minority group students perform about the same? And so he was interested in the views that they had about schooling, about the interpretations that they made about their life chances. And so what he came up with is this idea is that students relate to schooling based on how their particular group has been treated by that society and how they view those relationships. So he sorted groups into voluntary and involuntary minorities. So the voluntary minorities are willing immigrants and some refugees that have a choice. They're going to have a very different story about why they came to the host country. In this case, we're talking about the U.S. society, why they came here, what their countries were before this, what their relative chances are, and what it means to them. The involuntary minorities are people descended from Native Americans, people descended from Mexicans who were incorporated into the United States when the southern border dropped on top of them. So there are families here, there are Latino families here that trace their origin back to being Mexican citizens before the 1800s, when the border between the United States and Mexico changed after the Spanish and American War. That was early 1900s. And then you have African Americans who were descended from enslaved people who were brought against their will from their home countries. And African Americans are also descended from free Black people, but the way that they relate to the country is going to be similar in some cases, because again, Ogbu is speculating that this is based on how they see their group, and descendants of enslaved people and descendants of free African American people are going to have the same experiences because they weren't treated differently in a lot of cases. Now, we're doing interpretivist work, so we would be very interested in histories of families who descended exclusively from freed Black people and what stories they tell about themselves and their place in the United States. So, and that's very different. And African Americans from different class backgrounds will have different stories too, and more recent African immigrants, those who choose to leave their countries and come here, may identify as voluntary minorities, or depending on the treatment they see, they might identify with the group of involuntary minorities, even though that their migration was voluntary. And there's also differences in generations too. So even though your grandparents or parents might have been voluntary immigrants, if your particular group has been discriminated against historically, you might identify more with the involuntary minorities. So don't interpret that absolutely literally, voluntary or involuntary. It has to do more with the treatment of the group of people. So if people like me or who look like me or who people think look like me have always been treated poorly in school, then it makes no difference in how much I try in this society. I'm always going to be discriminated against. Or people like me have a better chance in this country than in my home country. We can improve ourselves with education. That's going to have a lot of implications, not just on the students' behavior in school, but in their sense of efficacy, in their sense of hope, in their resilience, and in the choices they make to stay within the education system. So they're more likely to interpret random acts of discrimination as just being bumps to get over in the road, not as part of or signs of a system that's out to get them. So also, interpretivists, right? Family and community factors and beliefs make a difference, make a real difference. So this is what Ogbu concludes. So even though we tend to see similar behaviors among those groups who are voluntary or involuntary, their particular family and particular community factor and beliefs actually make a difference in their beliefs and in their behaviors. And I've included for you an article by Howe called The Interpretive Turn. Now, this is quite dense, so if you're just skimming it, that's okay. And I wanted to point out for you the reasons that I give this to you. So sometimes I'll give you a reading so that you have the original source text from which I'm picking out some points that add to our understanding of these very broad theoretical fields. So the interpretive turn has to do with the recognition that there is a rise among the social sciences and within education in particular of interpretivism. So more and more people are recognizing the absolute necessity of investigating context, and the more and more people are recognizing multiple interpretations of phenomenon. So this is the piece recognizing starting in the 1980s that positivism or determinism, like this is absolutely going to happen, is dead. It's no longer the dominant paradigm. Even people who work exclusively with hard science data, with quantitative data, they recognize that they're not going to find the truth or the complete truth, if there even is a thing, and that there is no such thing as neutrality in interpreting human activity. As much as they try, they can come close, they can control and limit bias, but they can't entirely get rid of neutrality in interpretation of human activity. And there's absolutely no way to control completely for what humans are going to do and what meanings they're going to make of what they do. So constructionism rises as the preferred general epistemological position, meaning knowledge is socially created. So in most cases, if you're working in the social sciences, and in particular in education, and you had to guess someone's epistemological position, their theory of what knowledge is all about, how it's made, how it's evaluated, in most cases, guessing constructionism or constructivism, depending on whether you're UK or British, that's going to be a safe bet for you. Positivism doesn't have a place in the social sciences, and we see it still in the natural sciences where appropriate, where it's not conditioned by human activity, where phenomenon isn't conditioned by human activity. But in the social sciences, usually our options are constructivism or subjectivism, and subjectivism is an absolute position of interpretivism. So that's the absolute relativist position that sometimes constructivists making interpretive arguments are accused of. And so here, how kind of separates those positions, the more moderate or the more radical position, into postmodernism and transformationism, or transformationists, the postmodernists and transformationists. So they're both interpretivists. The postmodernists are completely done with the emancipatory project of modernity. So, for example, what that has to do with is the idea that there is an inevitable march of progress, that science is going to inevitably make society better, that our democratic and capitalist systems are inevitably going to make life better for people. And there's going to be more freedom, and there's going to be less poverty, and there's going to be more harmony. And we can see that doesn't always work out, right? So the postmodernists said they've given up on this. It makes no sense. And so they take a position of incredulity toward meta-narratives. They're going to be suspicious now of these ideas, including Marxism, right? Not just the functionalist idea, but Marxism as well. Western liberalism, American exceptionalism. The transformationists say, thinking about making society better is still something worth pursuing. It's flawed, of course, because there's nothing perfect and there's nothing inevitable about progress. It's arrangements. It has to do with social arrangements with laws. It has to do with tax policy. It has to do with voting policy. It has to do with banking policy. It has to do with housing policy, education policy, and social policy. So those things are worth pursuing. That's what the transformationists say. But they look, so these are the more moderates, and they look at the postmodernists as being relativistic, skeptical, and nihilistic. So, and the postmodernists are accused of having critique without action. So they're the ones that will tell you, well, it doesn't matter. It's all interpretation. They sometimes take a ludic position that any kind of project of emancipation or liberation is foolhardy because the systems are set up against this kind of project. So I wouldn't put postmodernists in a critical barrel entirely, but they do see, while still being suspicious of Marxism's ability to explain everything, they do see systems being set up as something rigid and something that will eventually allow power to flow to the powerful. So the transformationists here, they might be identified as pragmatists. So think of John Dewey. They might be some critical theorists, a lot of critical theorists actually, that take that constructivist epistemological position, whereas the postmodernists take that subjectivist epistemological position. And feminists, right? Feminists know that there is a history of structural inequality. I was just watching on PBS the history of the vote and how many decades of struggle it took for women to achieve the right to vote. And it was just won by a narrow margin, too. So what we have in this country is a history of concerted efforts to limit the amount of people who can vote. That's our history. And I don't think that that's particularly a Marxist way of looking at things. That's just a neutral way of looking at history. So do we, as the postmodernists, then give up and say this is our lot, our ridiculous lot? We call ourselves a democracy, but we have never been interested in giving everyone the power to rule? Or do we say, these are our aspirations and they're worth fighting for, and it's imperfect, but we should still work toward these goals? So, for example, you can say as a postmodernist that gender is just a social construction. So it doesn't really, what you have to say about gender politics doesn't mean anything because gender is something that's made up. Okay, tell that to the women who were fighting for the vote, tell that to gay, lesbian, trans people who are discriminated against, right? Gender is just a construct, but there are severe consequences for people who don't operate according to the dominant role expectations of gender in whatever society they happen to be in. So we have Benjamin Barber, another sociologist, who is quoted in Howe's piece, "The powerful toy with reason, the powerless need it." So he's taking a jab at the postmodernists who are critical of reason and rational processes and say, well, that it's all meaningless. It's all worthless. Might as well do what you want. Do what makes you happy. So that comes from a privileged position, right? You can debate whether or not something is really true or not. Or you can respond to the consequences of the beliefs of the powerful. Okay, so that's the transformationists. Both of these folks, all interpretivists working within the U.S. As far as educational philosophy, both of them say that they're committed to democratic processes, right? But here's the thing, educators, they can't afford to be postmodernists. They can't afford to be politically neutral here. They have to take a position one way or another. So it's a very comfortable, I guess. It's a good fit theoretically for educators who see things from an interpretive lens to be transformationists rather than postmodernists. We don't want educators in our system who've given up and who say that just simply doesn't matter. Okay. So that's it.